And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This essay began not with a theory, but with a pause, a moment of recognition, quiet and real, while reading Brené Brown. Her work gave language to the parts of ourselves that tremble, that long to be seen, that fear we are not enough. She reframed vulnerability as the birthplace of connection, not weakness, but the act of being fully human. That insight opened something, but it also raised a harder question. What if not everyone is safe enough to be vulnerable? That question did not close Brown's insight, deepened it. It became the doorway to this piece. What follows is not a rejection of Brown's work, but a carrying of it out of the self-help space and into the structural, political, and ethical. It asks, who is allowed to be vulnerable without punishment? Who must prove their pain to be believed? What do institutions demand from emotional openness, and what do they give in return? It moves from the personal to the systemic, from story to structure. The essay draws on many thinkers, some named, most not. The moral philosophy of Levinas, the institutional critique of Sara Ahmed, the trauma wisdom of Gabor Mate, the embodied resistance of Claudia Rankine, the political realism of Ta-Nehisi Coates, the liberatory care ethic of bell hooks. And through it all, Brown's voice remains quiet, generous, and brave. This is an essay about vulnerability, but not just as disclosure, as design, as dignity, as a social architecture that makes room not only for pain, but for change. It is about what happens after someone speaks and whether the world listens with more than applause. It does not seek to inspire. It seeks to rearrange. Because if we truly value vulnerability, then the question is no longer how to ask for it. The question is whether we are willing to build what it requires. Of all the words that drift across modern psychology, few have travelled as far or pierced as deeply as vulnerability. In the work of Brené Brown, vulnerability is not merely a state of emotion, it is the precondition of connection. Her research, rooted in qualitative interviews and a social work tradition, begins from a human ache. Why do we fear being seen, and what keeps us from believing we are worthy of love? Vulnerability, she finds, is not weakness but the raw material of closeness, and the avoidance of it, through shame, perfectionism, or emotional armour, places us at odds with the very connection we long for. Brown's foundational insight is that connection is why we're here. Across interviews spanning grief, trauma, belonging, exclusion, and joy, she identified connection as the animating force of human experience. But she also found that the central obstacle to connection is shame, an internalized fear that we're not worthy of belonging. Shame, unlike guilt, does not accuse the act but the self. It isolates, it whispers, if they knew who you really were, you would be cast out, and it thrives in silence. Yet Brown does not stay with pathology. Her work opens into a landscape of possibility. She introduces the notion of wholeheartedness, a quality shared by those who live with a strong sense of worthiness. These individuals are not free from pain or self-doubt, but they are marked by a specific posture, the courage to be imperfect, the compassion to be kind to themselves, and the authenticity to let go of who they think they should be in order to be who they are. Their lives are not necessarily easier, but they are more porous, more relational, more alive. Vulnerability in this framing is not something to overcome, but to enter. It is the space of uncertainty and emotional risk that makes intimacy possible. Brown observes that vulnerability is not comfortable and often excruciating, but it is also necessary. It is the birthplace of love, joy, belonging, and creativity. We cannot selectively numb it. If we anesthetize our grief, fear, or shame, we also numb our delight, our wonder, our gratitude. This is not a therapeutic slogan. It is an epistemology, a way of knowing the world through presence rather than protection. To believe I am enough is not a motivational mantra, but a philosophical stance. It interrupts the scarcity narrative. It softens the compulsion to perfect. It makes possible a gentler listening toward ourselves and each other. But it is also a stance that lives, not only in thought, but in the nervous system, in the breath that returns after a held silence, in the shoulders that loosen when we feel we will not be punished for our truth. And yet, even as Brown dignifies this interior terrain, Her work invites a deeper question. What are the social conditions in which vulnerability is possible? Who gets to be seen without punishment? Who gets to fall apart and still be held? If vulnerability is the precondition for connection, then structural safety must be the precondition for vulnerability. And that is where the next section must begin. If vulnerability is the threshold of connection, then its denial must be understood not merely as an individual fear, but as a cultural training, one shaped in large part by gender. Ironically, and perhaps most cruelly, it is often men, those most conditioned to suppress vulnerability, who are most deprived by its absence. They are taught early that emotion is a liability, tenderness a risk, and exposure a weakness. This conditioning is not accidental. It is rehearsed, rewarded, and replicated across generations. And then in a bitter twist, those same men are faulted for failing to connect, failing to express, failing to feel. Masculinity, as historically constructed, equates openness with danger. To be seen is to be made vulnerable, and to be vulnerable is to relinquish control. The ideal male form, strong, composed, self-sufficient, is built to withstand. But what it also does is withhold. The cost is connection, not just with others, but with oneself. The body armors, the language flattens, the effect contracts. When these men are asked to open up, to show what they were trained to bury, it is no small act. It is a crossing of code. And often they are not rewarded for their courage. They are laughed at, dismissed, or doubted. Emotional honesty in men is still too often read as weakness, instability, or shameful need. But men are not alone in this betrayal. All those who live in culturally marginalized bodies, women, queer and trans people, racialized communities, disabled individuals, migrants, are made vulnerable long before they ever choose to be. They are born into exposure. Visibility is not granted, it is enforced. Their movements are watched, their words scrutinized, their failures amplified. For them, vulnerability is not a performance, it is a condition, and it is not always safe to deepen it. This is the quiet hypocrisy of modern emotional culture. It romanticizes vulnerability but punishes those who live in it. It invites openness but refuses to change when people speak. It asks for stories but cannot bear their consequence. What is rewarded as bravery in some becomes destabilizing in others. A man crying in a boardroom is seen as raw. A woman doing the same is seen as unprofessional. A queer person expressing fear may be read as fragile. A black person expressing anger may be seen as threatening. The same emotions move through different bodies and are read through different scripts, so we must be precise. Vulnerability is not a universal virtue. It is a politicized state. To name that some are asked to be braver than others just to be heard is not to diminish the concept. It is to dignify it. Because to be vulnerable and received is healing. To be vulnerable and ignored is rewounding. And to be vulnerable and punished is structural violence. If we are to the ethic that Brown gifts us, we must extend it. We must ask, who is made to prove their pain? Who must narrate their suffering to access care? Who is told their feelings are too much or not enough or poorly timed? These are not rhetorical questions. They are architectural ones, because the scaffolding of emotional life is not neutral. And until it is restructured, vulnerability will remain a privilege offered to some and a burden borne by others. If we are to honor vulnerability as more than a personal breakthrough, as an ethical stance and social proposition, then we must attend to what happens after someone speaks. The moment of disclosure, raw and unguarded, is often seen as the culmination of bravery, but its real test lies in response. Does the environment adapt? Does the listener hold the weight without turning away? Does the system, be it workplace, institution, or culture, reorganize around what has been offered? Too often the answer is no. This is the unspoken failure of modern emotional life. We ask for authenticity, but design for conformity. We promote psychological safety, but build systems of surveillance. We encourage truth-telling, then treat it as disruption. The workplace becomes a performance of care, where vulnerability is encouraged in the abstract, but penalized in practice. The classroom invites reflection, but only within curricular boundaries. The healthcare system collects trauma histories without reconfiguring care, and the public square, especially online, turns emotion into content, spectacle, material for judgment rather than grounds for empathy or transformation. Here, vulnerability becomes commodified, curated, stripped of its demands. Personal narratives circulate rapidly, sometimes virally, but the structures remain static. The disclosure becomes the product, the context untouched. This is not connection, it is consumption. And it asks us to look squarely at how the system metabolizes pain, what it rewards, what it ignores, and what it refuses to change. To resist this commodification, we must begin to think of vulnerability as design, not in aesthetic terms, but in structural ones. What would it mean to build institutions that are emotionally porous, to construct timelines, workflows, policies, and spaces around the premise that people break, pause, grieve, and erupt? This would mean moving from permission to capacity, from you can share to we are built to respond. In a culture that equates value with productivity, vulnerability slows things down. It introduces friction. It demands attention. It does not yield a measurable return on investment. And that perhaps is its most radical function. It interrupts. It says, someone is not okay and we will not continue until they are safe. That interruption, if honored, can remake the room. But first we must name the deeper failure, that many people are not just unseen, they are structurally unheld. Their vulnerability is not invisible, it is disbelieved. Or worse, it is extracted as proof and then denied as excess. They are told to speak, then dismissed for speaking too much. This is the moment when vulnerability ceases to be connective and becomes coercive. So the ethical question is no longer just who will open up. It is, what do we owe each other when we do? Vulnerability, real vulnerability, requires an architecture around it, a responsiveness that is both emotional and material. Anything less is not care. It is choreography, and anything less than change is not listening. To truly honor vulnerability, we must build beyond permission. A culture that invites people to speak must also be prepared to change when they do. Without that, the act of disclosure becomes hollow, a gesture toward connection with no corresponding shift in structure, policy, or power. We cannot ask people to open themselves unless we are also willing to reconfigure what surrounds them. Vulnerability must be met not with passive empathy, but with active design. Design, in this sense, is ethical infrastructure. It is the slow, unglamorous work of removing penalties for being real. It is the rearrangement of time, space, and expectation to allow for the full presence of people. Those who grieve too long, speak too plainly, take too many pauses, or feel too much. These are not disruptions to be smoothed over. They are signals, invitations to reimagine what it means to belong. An ethical workplace, for example, does not ask for emotional honesty without providing structural refuge. It does not hold well-being days while punishing sick leave. It does not promote openness while disciplining dissent. Similarly, an ethical classroom understands that learning is not always forward motion. It allows for rupture, ambiguity, contradiction. It treats the wound not as deviation, but as data. And an ethical healthcare system does not merely document trauma. It adjusts itself in response, slower intake processes, more time for questions, fewer assumptions of compliance. In each case, the vulnerable act is not consumed, it is integrated. But perhaps the most urgent design challenge is how we respond to collective vulnerability. The grief of a community after violence, the silence of a workplace after someone collapses, the tension in a room when someone discloses harm. In these moments, we are shown whether our systems were built for comfort or for care, whether they protect the status quo or the people inside them. True listening reshapes the conditions in which future speech occurs. This is the relational architecture vulnerability requires. And it cannot be decorative. It cannot exist in slogans or side initiatives. It must live in the core, in meeting agendas, in disciplinary protocols, in how breaks are managed, in how feedback is received. Because without material expression, care remains a theory. And without care, vulnerability is not brave, it is dangerous. To move forward, we must ask, what do we design for? Predictability, efficiency, or human presence? The answer to that question will determine whether vulnerability becomes a bridge or a trap, and whether those who offer themselves to the room will be met with reverence or regret. This shift from vulnerability as virtue to vulnerability as structure changes the moral center of the conversation. It reframes the question from how can we be more open to what do we need to change so that openness is no longer a gamble? Because until that shift is made, we risk placing the entire burden of progress on the person who speaks. We ask them to risk rejection, carry the emotional labor, and model the very qualities the system has not earned the right to receive. That is not transformation, it is extraction. A culture of ethical vulnerability does not simply accommodate emotion, it adapts in its presence. It listens not as performance but as commitment. It hears the rupture and stops. It absorbs the discomfort and does not retaliate. It acknowledges when it is not ready and works to become so. This kind of culture is not aspirational, it is operational. It is written into the quiet norms, the unspoken allowances, the things no one has to ask for because they are already expected. And still, even in these cultures, we must make room for refusal. Vulnerability must never be compulsory. The right to be seen includes the right not to be. The right to speak must be matched by the right to remain silent without consequence. We must recognize that some wounds are not ready for air, some stories not ready for language. This too is integrity. Because when people are invited to be vulnerable without pressure, without judgment, without expectation, they are more likely to trust that the space is real. There is also the question of grief, not the resolved, narrativized grief that fits into designated timeframes, but the kind that lingers, unfixed and unfixable. An ethical culture does not ask that pain to be quickly metabolized. It learns to walk beside it. It allows for its slow return. It does not demand resolution in order to remain patient. This is the deeper work of building places that do not pathologize human difficulty, places where a person can be in process and still be protected. In such a culture, vulnerability is not an event. It is a language, a rhythm, a mutual agreement. It circulates not through confession, but through accommodation. It is built into doorways that do not shame late arrivals, into meetings that pause for silence, into emails that end with softness, into systems that respond to feeling not with suspicion, but with redesign. To say you are safe here is not a promise made with words. It is demonstrated daily in what happens next. And this is what the work demands, not louder declarations of care, but quieter, deeper architectures of response. Not more emotional courage from the individual, but more ethical preparation from the collective. Vulnerability is not proof of strength. It is evidence of trust, and it is trust that must be earned by the world. To build a world that earns that trust, we must go beyond culture into covenant, beyond invitation into responsibility. The ethic of vulnerability is not fulfilled by saying, "We see you." It is fulfilled by ensuring that what we see does not fall into a void. Every act of openness carries with it a question: will I still belong after this? An ethical system must answer that question before it is asked. That answer cannot be improvisational, it must be designed. It must exist in how power is held and distributed, how feedback is received, how harm is acknowledged and addressed. It must live in the rhythm of collective life, where roles flex to accommodate grief, where time slows for care, where people are not punished for needing time, space, quiet, repair. This is not about emotional indulgence. It is about emotional integrity. When someone breaks in a meeting, we do not say, "Take your time," and then quietly note their unreliability. When someone cannot perform, we do not ask them to justify their absence with shame-coded language. When someone names a harm, we do not thank them for their courage and proceed as before. We stop, we adjust, we move differently because we have been changed by what was said. And in that adjustment is the proof of our ethics. Not in how beautifully we speak about inclusion, but in how deeply we reconfigure in its name. The moment of vulnerability is not a final gesture, it is a first offering. What comes after is the measure of our readiness to hold it. So we must ask, are we willing to be shaped by each other, not inspired, not moved, but reformed? Are we willing to allow someone's truth to alter how we organize space, time, expectations, and care? If not, then our invitations to vulnerability are invitations to harm. But if so, if we are willing, then vulnerability becomes more than personal. It becomes cultural practice. It becomes moral architecture. It becomes the condition for a different kind of belonging, one not earned through performance, but offered through presence. One not defined by seamlessness, but by the grace of being unfinished together. This is the final ethic, that we owe each other not just attention, but adaptation, not just compassion, but recalibration. Not just space to speak, but structures that answer. Vulnerability, then, is not a destination. It is the door, What matters now is whether we will walk through it and what we are willing to carry when we do. To believe we are enough is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of responsibility, not just to ourselves, but to one another. Because worthiness on its own is a quiet truth. It only becomes real when the world bends around it, when structures soften, when institutions pause, when we answer not only with words, but with reconfiguration. This is where vulnerability completes its arc, not in the moment of exposure, but in the act of being received. And not just by individuals, but by systems that choose to be humane. The future of connection depends on this, not whether we can be raw, but whether our rawness is protected, not whether we speak, but whether someone listens and rearranges the room. And still, the most powerful gesture we can make may not be to demand vulnerability at all, but to create conditions in which it need not be so costly. We need fewer invitations to be brave and more environments in which bravery is no longer the price of being seen. What Brown showed us is that vulnerability opens the door. What we do with that opening is now up to us. We can continue to ask people to trust us, or we can build the world that is already worthy of their trust. We can meet each act of exposure not with admiration, but with accommodation, not with applause, but with change. Because the real test is not whether someone speaks, it is whether we stop, listen, and alter the ground beneath them. Vulnerability, then, is not proof of virtue. It is a call to reimagine what care looks like, not as sentiment, but as structure, not as posture, but as policy. The measure of a just society is not how loudly it affirms that everyone matters. It is how consistently it acts as though that is already true. Vulnerability does not ask us to feel more. It asks us to build better and to make belonging a condition of design, not a reward for performance. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.